A New Frontier in the Great Society. In this unit, we're going to look at the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and as well as major actions taken in the Civil Rights Movement and the United States getting more involved in the Vietnam War conflict. At the end of this unit, the American U.S. history student should be able to understand the following questions. How did President John F. Kennedy try to contain communism abroad and pursue civil rights and other social programs at home? 2. What were the strategies and achievements of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and what divisions emerged along its activities? 3. What were President Lyndon Baines Johnson's major war on poverty and Great Society initiatives? How did they impact American society? 4. What were Kennedy and Johnson's motivations for deepening America's military involvement in the Vietnam War? And 5. What issues propelled Richard Nixon to victory in the 1968 presidential election? The New Frontier. John Kennedy's poise and precision in debates with Richard Nixon impressed viewers and voters. In the 1960 presidential election, Vice President Nixon was nominated for the presidency representing the Republicans, while the Democrats chose Senator John F. Kennedy, known as JFK. Kennedy, who was sickly by nature, concealed his health issues through personal actions, much like Franklin Roosevelt had. This election was marked by the first televised debate between presidential candidates. This turned out to be the closest election since 1888. Kennedy received 303 electoral votes and Nixon's 219 electoral votes, with only 118,574 votes between them. When he won the election, JFK became the first Roman Catholic to serve as president. His ambivalence to the civil rights movement during the election was similar to Eisenhower's, but his intervention to help release Martin Luther King Jr. from prison in Georgia helped sway African American voters in his favor. Having Lyndon Baines Johnson as his vice president running mate also helped with Kennedy's balancing act of trying to court African American voters while maintaining the southern white vote that his team needed to win. Here we see the election map of 1960. When the election results actually came out, Nixon was told that there might be some disparity in the vote coming out of Illinois that went for Kennedy, that there might have been some fraud, as well as West Virginia, which later on was discovered that there was some impropriety in both states. But Nixon said, no, Mr. Kennedy is our president, and would not contest the election results. JFK was the youngest president elected, although Theodore Roosevelt was younger when William McKinley died. Kennedy chose to select for his administration leaders of the industry instead of political appointees to provide fresh ideas. Kennedy's inaugural address focused on foreign affairs and the role of the United States in defending freedom in the world. His youth and reputation for athletics helped JFK hide his struggles with Addison's disease and other medical issues, and his public image as the husband and father of a young, charming family, and his many affairs with prominent women, including Marilyn Monroe. Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby, JFK's younger brother, became his attorney general, despite his youth and lack of qualifications or experience. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, and McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor. Camelot. Young, dashing, wealthy, and culturally sophisticated, the Kennedys were instant celebrities. Women imitated the First Lady's famous hairdo, while men admired JFK's effortless cool and youthful energy. His administration was called Camelot, based on the Broadway-winning play at the time, and the president's favorite, especially the song, Camelot.
Was made a distant moon ago here. July and August cannot be too hot. And there's a legal limit to the snow here in Camelot. The winter is forbidden till December, and exits March the 2nd on the dot. By order, summer lingers through September in Camelot. Camelot, Camelot, I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but in Camelot, Camelot. That's how conditions are.
A balky Congress. JFK's domestic program was called the New Frontier. He founded many of his programs blocked by partisans in Congress. He did succeed in getting the Housing Act passed, which provided $5 billion for urban renewal over 4 years and the creation of a Peace Corps. His Equal Pay Act required that women and men performing the same job receive equal pay. Overall, Congress approved only about half of the 355 legislative requests that JFK sent in his first year. One of JFK's key legislative successes was the commitment of Congress to spend $40 billion to send America into the moon within 10 years. This was America's response to the USSR launching the first manned spaceflight in 1961 and another step in the space race. JFK and civil rights. Segregation and racial inequality remained issues, despite legal changes such as Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 that said that schools need to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Both John and Bobby saw the importance of the civil rights movement, but they, like FDR and Eisenhower before them, recognized the political and social dangers that threatened to erupt into violence and undermine their political popularity and JFK's chance for re-election. If white Southern Democrats felt forced, JFK appointed Harris Wofford as his special presidential assistant for civil rights and expected Wofford, a white law professor and civil rights campaigner, to find a way to confront racial discrimination in the least politically dangerous way possible. The Mercury Project. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri A. Gagarin becomes the first human being to go to space and return safely back to Earth. The United States played catch-up with the Soviet space program, beginning with Sputnik and now with the first man in space. But Kennedy provided momentum by promising to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Alan Shepard would become the first of the Mercury 7 to fly into space, lifting off on May 5, 1961, atop of the Redstone rocket in the Freedom 7 capsule. The flight lasted all about 15 and a half minutes. John Glenn was the third American in space and the first one to orbit the Earth. When JFK came into office, he learned of a plan of the CIA to train Cuban exiles to retake Cuba with the promise of air support and to have them overthrow Castro. The plan, which landed the Cubans at the Bay of Pigs, ultimately failed. The Bay of Pigs invasion humiliated by the United States by making the government appear inexperienced and incompetent. At the Vienna Summit, 2 months after that, he met with Khrushchev in Vienna, Austria, who bullied and threatened the inexperienced Kennedy. Upon returning home and learning that about 70 million Americans might die if the USSR and the United States had a nuclear war, JFK called up the Army Reserves and National Guard to protect West Berlin. The Soviets responded by erecting the Berlin Wall, dividing West and East Berlin. The Berlin Wall became a tangible symbol of Churchill's Iron Curtain and the vision of Europe in the Cold War context. Kennedy and Secretary of State Defense Robert McNamara recognized the challenge that Khrushchev and the USSR had offered by building the Berlin Wall. They increased the United States' number of nuclear missiles and built up the armed forces by adding 300,000 troops and created the Green Berets, a U.S. Special Forces group to provide military flexibility for the United States to respond to threats around the world. Kennedy would travel to Berlin and in front of the Brandenburg Gate to try to show his solidarity with the West Berliners, said famously, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Now, the president thought he said, "I, too, am a Berliner," but the translation really means, "I am a jelly donut." From conflicts to talks, the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 16th through the 28th, 1962. On October 15th, the CIA, looking at photos, discovered Soviet missile launchers and missile shelters near San Cristobal, Cuba. They are put there to protect Castro from another attempted coup. The next day, on the 16th, JFK and his advisors decided to quarantine the island around Cuba, but not calling it a blockade, which would be considered an act of war. Nothing will be allowed in or out until the missiles were removed. For a few days, it looked like the United States and the Soviet Union would actively go to war against each other, threatening to make the Cold War hot. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced the discovery of the missiles installations to the public and his intentions to quarantine the island. On October 24th, Soviet ships stopped just short of the quarantine line. On October 25th, Kennedy pulled the quarantine line back and raised the military readiness to DEFCON 2. DEFCON was a series of levels that the United States would go through before going to war. And in DEFCON 2, that means the bombers were already loaded with hydrogen bombs, waiting for the order to hit their targets in the Soviet Union should DEFCON 1 be given. On the 26th, ex-com heard from Khrushchev in an impassioned letter. He proposed removing Soviet missiles and personnel if the U.S. would guarantee not to invade Cuba. On October 27th was the worst day of a crisis. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba and the pilot killed. And ex-com received a second letter from Khrushchev demanding the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles in Cuba. Attorney General Robert Kennedy suggested ignoring the second letter and contacted Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to tell him the U.S. agreement with the first. Tensions finally began to ease on October 28th when Khrushchev announced that he would dismantle the installations and return the missiles to the Soviet Union, expressing his trust that the United States would not invade Cuba. Further negotiations were held to implement the October 28th agreement, including a United States demand that Soviet light bombers be removed from Cuba, and specifically the exact form and conditions of the U.S. assurances not to invade Cuba, while the U.S. vowed to remove some missiles from Turkey in 6 months, provided the Soviet Union would not say anything in public. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Both sides recognized the danger that each of them caused by approaching open warfare, and closely in the aftermath, they took steps to try to prevent future conflicts of this sort. The United States agreed to sell surplus wheat to the USSR, which was not producing enough of its own wheat, and the two nations installed hotline telephones that could be used by leaders to contact each other directly or in case of future threats. Kennedy and his advisors recognized the need to scale back their aggressive rhetoric against the USSR. In a speech at American University on June 10, 1963, JFK said that his goal was not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. Soon after this, the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain held talks to discuss ways to minimize the risk of nuclear war in the future. In September of 1963, the three signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear weapons of testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Scientists had discovered the damage that was being done by these tests. Vietnam. South Vietnam was being supported by the might of the United States. However, South Vietnamese Premier Ngo Dinh Diem was showing an unwillingness to govern his people wisely or listen to American advice. As communist forces continued to invade the South, Kennedy dispatched 16,000 military advisors to the region to train the soldiers. The National Liberation Front, backed by communist North Vietnam, trained and launched the Viet Cong, VC, a guerrilla force that blended with civilians. The United States recommended the relocation of South Vietnamese peasants to strategic hamlets for their protection against the VC and deter them from joining the VC. In the fall of 1963, the United States supported a coup against the premier, and he was murdered, unfortunately, leaving a power vacuum in South Vietnam. The United States chose Vietnamese generals to lead the country, and South Vietnam basically became an American colony, even as JFK recognized the United States' position in Vietnam was precarious. Kennedy's assassination and a trip to Dallas to mend political offenses due to his supporting of civil rights. Lee Harvey Oswald, who did a tour of duty in U.S. Marines and had defected to the Soviet Union before returning to the United States to express fervent support of Fidel Castro, was in Dallas. And on November 22, 1963, JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas, as his motorcade drove past the Texas School Books Depository. President John F. Kennedy's assassination led to LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, to assume the presidency and taking the oath of office aboard Air Force One. Oswald would later be shot and killed by Jack Ruby while in transportation to a court hearing, and the event was recorded on national television. Johnson formed the Warren Commission, which left many loose ends to its investigation of the Kennedy assassination. There's a variety of theories concerning Oswald's motivations or whether or not he was part of a larger conspiracy. Ultimately, the Warren Commission concluded that he was the lone gunman. Civil rights triumphant. Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Billy Smith, and Clarence Henderson, seated left from right, await service on day 2 of their sit-ins at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. A painful irony of Jim Crow system, how African Americans could work at diners, they're just not allowed to eat at the lunch counter of diners. Promoting their cause by nonviolent demonstration, African Americans continued to protest the inequality of society. When 4 African American college students sat at the whites-only counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, a Woolworth store, and refused to move, the concept of the sit-in was born. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, formed in April 1960 to organize similar demonstrations to highlight white racism in the face of nonviolence. The Freedom Rides. In 1961, to test a federal order banning segregation of buses, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, sent groups of people on trips across the country to make sure the laws were upheld. As they expected, the Freedom Riders, as they were called, met with resistance and often became violent as they traveled from Washington, D.C. through the Lower South to New Orleans. On May 14th, one bus was firebombed by a group of KKK members in rural Alabama who sought to kill the riders and brutally beat those who escaped the burning bus. Another bus riders met violence in Birmingham, Alabama, and had been encouraged by the city's police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor. Both attacks were aired on national television and spurred the recruitment of additional Freedom Riders. JFK tried to discourage these passionate youth and to encourage civil rights leaders to slow down their activism, especially as he attempted to meet with Khrushchev and did not want to deal with the public relations problems caused by the obvious problems within the United States that the Soviet leader would use to support his own social, political, and economic system. Civil rights leaders, however, responded that their ancestors had waited for years for equal rights and they were not going to stop. Federal intervention occurred against the Freedom Riders, the Kennedy administration to intervene. The Justice Department would send 400 U.S. Marshals to protect the riders to Jackson, Mississippi. James Meredith, an Air Force veteran whose grandfather had been a slave, challenged the University of Mississippi in Oxford for segregation when he tried to enroll in the all-white university in the fall of 1962. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett publicly intervened to try to stop Meredith from enrolling and desegregating the university. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent in federal marshals to enforce a federal law abolishing segregation at the University of Mississippi when the governor refused to abide by it. So JFK sent in members of the National Guard, and despite the rioting that ensued, Meredith successfully registered for classes and attended the university. Civil rights movement in Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. led a series of nonviolent resistance demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, where the openly racist Governor George Wallace had once said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." There, the police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, led the all-white police force and used police dogs, tear gas, electric cattle prods, high-pressure fire hoses, and condoned violence against the protesters. King had determined that a victory in Birmingham would break the back of segregation all over the nation by highlighting brutality openly in the light of the day when the rest of the world is looking on. especially using national television to show the United States and the world how far racist white Southerners were willing to go to protect segregation. King's letter from Birmingham jail famously called moderate white Americans to action and to embrace justice and equality over fear and disorder. He defended the use of nonviolent civil disobedience. King acknowledged that civil rights protesters, sometimes nonviolently, broke laws they considered to be unjust, accepting the penalty to bring the light of the injustice and to promote equality. Continuing on with the civil rights movement in Alabama, civil rights and racial integration came slowly in the lower South at a high cost to individuals who fought for them. Alabama remained a stronghold for segregation in schools and colleges until June 11, 1963, when JFK announced that he would submit a new civil rights bill to Congress soon in response to Governor Wallace's attempt to physically block African American students from registering for classes at the University of Alabama. Medgar Evers, a 37-year-old African American civil rights activist who was excited by JFK's speech, was killed when a white racist shot him outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi. Kennedy responded by hosting his first meeting at the White House with leaders of the civil rights movement. The high point of the civil rights movement occurred at the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. The event was organized to support Kennedy's proposed civil rights bill, which was being blocked in the House of Representatives by Southern Democrats. Around 250,000 individuals of a variety of races and ages came to the mall in Washington, D.C. to support the proposed legislation. 18 days after King's famous speech, KKK members killed 4 young girls when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church on Sunday morning. One girl who missed Sunday school that morning was sick, and her daddy refused to let her go despite her pleas. It was her friends that were killed in the blast. That young lady would grow up to become the first African American woman Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. The Supreme Court, with Chief Justice Earl Warren at its head, continued to be a decisive influence on domestic life in this era. In Mapp v. Ohio, the court ruled that evidence seized illegally cannot be used in court. In Engel v. Vitale in 1962, it abolished public school prayer. In Gideon v. Wainwright of 1963, it required a lawyer for every defendant, regardless of their ability to pay. And in Miranda v. Arizona, 1966, that those who are being arrested should be notified of their constitutional rights. These are just some of the example of the landmark cases of the Warren Court. Freedom Summer. Robert Moses, an African-American Harvard-educated New Yorker, led a march on Mississippi's capital to protest the state's denial of right to vote to minorities. Many of the activists for this Freedom Summer campaign were white college students, often Jewish, who went through extensive training to prepare them from the violence they almost certainly would encounter when they went to Mississippi. His group's subsequent actions led to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. The violence included the abduction and killing of 3 young SNCC workers, James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Mickey Schreiner. The search for their bodies turned up 8 other bodies of black men who had been killed violently. Many civil rights protesters, especially younger people, began to question King's nonviolent resistance and a call for stronger action against racism across the United States. The Black Power movement. In the mid-1960s, differences over tactics created division in the civil rights movement. There was de jure segregation, which was segregation by the law in the South, and de facto segregation, which was segregation that resulted from the habit and tradition that was in the North. For example, a concentration of urban African Americans in slum areas is an example of de facto segregation. A race riot in Watts would occur in a neighborhood in California, led off a summer of racial violence in 1966. After 6 days, 34 people were killed and property worth $30 million was destroyed. Many young people embraced the more militant Black Power movement and its more radical separatism and Black nationalism after becoming frustrated with the slow progress and pain they associated with the more moderate civil rights movement. In 1966, for example, the new leader of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, forced whites out of SNCC, asserting that they were hindering the movement. The Black Power movement emerged as a more violent and radical portion of the civil rights movement that competed with the nonviolent resistance of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little, Malcolm was the top of his 8th grade class when he approached the teacher he admired, informing her that he wanted to become a lawyer when he grew up. Her response is, "Who would want a," using the N word, as a lawyer? This devastated him, and he soon would drop out after school. He would then become a petty thief and drug addict until he was caught, convicted, and sent to prison. It was in prison where Malcolm would educate himself and join the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm would take the name of Malcolm X, saying X being the unknown factor, and that Little was the name of the slave masters of his ancestors. He would become one of the early leaders of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X preached Elijah Muhammad's views of separatism and self-respect, and also respect to women. He advocated self-defense, saying, "If you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary." Malcolm's controversial statements had two effects. First, it scared the living hell out of whites. And second, his popularity began to override Elijah Muhammad's. In March of 1964, Malcolm would officially break with Elijah Muhammad due to a number of young women coming forward and claiming that their newborn child's father was Elijah Muhammad. When Malcolm X approached Elijah Muhammad, he did deny it, claiming that as a great prophet, he needed to spread his seed. Malcolm would take a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is required of all Muslims who have the means. And he discovered that Islam preaches the equality of all races. And when he returned, he began to preach a new message that emphasized exercising the right to vote. However, on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. The Black Panther Party. Stokely Carmichael left SNCC for the Black Panther Party for self-defense, a militant self-defense and black nationalist organization that formed after San Francisco police killed an unarmed African-American teen, Matthew Johnson. The group's leader, Huey P. Newton, and Bobby Seale rejected moderation and integration, focusing instead on self-defense and promoting self-sustaining and self-patrolling black communities separate from those of white Americans. The FBI would label the groups as a terrorist organization, and by 1982, the FBI's efforts to undermine the party and trouble within the group relating to drugs and conflicts among leaders had destroyed the Black Panther Party. Despite its dissolution, the Black Panther Party left its impact. Most of its members were women, and most of those who were feminists, despite its emphasis on masculine power. In 1969, the party de-emphasized masculinity and began working for the equality of all men and women within the organization. The Civil Rights Movement. An Alabama motel you see pictured here offers its white patrons chilled water from a cooler, while its African American guests must use a simple drinking fountain, labeled colored. When Ike entered the White House, he was committed to civil rights in principle and worked to expand opportunities for minorities in federal agencies. In 1953, he appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Warren would be instrumental during the civil rights movement. Since the 1930s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had worked to overturn the separate but equal separation rule established in Plessy v. Ferguson. In 1950, the Sweat versus Painter, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that this rule was not followed at the University of Texas and ordered the state to remedy it to allow African Americans to attend the university. The Brown decision. A 25-year legal campaign to end segregation culminated in the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka that declared school segregation unconstitutional. Lyndon Brown, whose family lived close to a white school, was forced to attend the segregated black elementary school. The case of Brown and the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was the culmination of actually several other distinct schools being sued in the court for violation of the 14th Amendment. The interesting part of the Brown case was that, ironically, the black and white schools in Topeka were inherently separate and equal. Because they were equal is the reason the NAACP chose to represent the case. If Linda Brown was not allowed to attend the white school, therefore the only conclusion could be that it was because of the color of her skin. And this would be a violation of equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal outlined in Plessy v. Ferguson was inherently unequal in education, and such inequality led to feelings of inferiority among African American children. The court's decision asserted that racial integration of schools should happen with all deliberate speed. The Eisenhower administration was reluctant to force the integration. White Southerners' response. Eisenhower recognized that both white leaders and many white Southerners would vehemently defend segregation and worried that forcing the process would increase hostility and violence. As he would say, it is easier to change men's minds than their hearts. The Ku Klux Klan and other racist organizations, including new middle-class citizens' councils, gained membership. To some degree, it became difficult for white Southern politicians and business owners to succeed without joining a citizens' council. 3 Southern Democrats, including Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, were the only Southern congressmen who refused to sign the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, known as the Southern Manifesto, that asserted that the Supreme Court and other judicial activism had increased tensions and hostility in the South by their decision that sought to integrate society. Montgomery bus boycott. Many Southern cities had ordinances that required African Americans to be seated at the back of all public buses. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress, refused to give up her seat in the colored section of the bus to a white man and moved to the back of the bus and was arrested. African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, organized a boycott the next night, led by Martin Luther King Jr. of Atlanta. The boycott would last 381 days, and a year later, the protesters would win a case. On November 13, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ordered the state of Alabama to desegregate all public buses. This ruling was upheld in a lower court ruling known as Browder v. Gale. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would seek to promote civil rights through nonviolent resistance. King drew his ideas from his teachings of Henry David Thoreau, who went to jail for not filing to pay his income taxes that would support the war with Mexico. Mahatma Gandhi, which you see pictured behind Dr. King there in the photograph, who was able to get the British Empire to leave his native India through peaceful protests, boycotts, and hunger strikes. And of course, being a Christian minister, Jesus of Nazareth, through love thy neighbor and turn the other cheek. And A. Philip Randolph. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, was an organization led by Dr. King and sought to move beyond the perceived over-reliance by the NAACP on the court system. They promoted direct action, underscored by non-violent civil disobedience, to confront racism and segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1957. On August 29, 1957, the United States Congress symbolically acknowledged that the U.S. government had some responsibility for the rights of its black citizens. It prohibited discrimination in public places. It created a Civil Rights Commission and the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. It also strengthened the efforts of blacks to register and to vote. Senator Strom Thurmond filibustered against the act for a record 24 hours and 27 minutes to try to keep it from passing. Eisenhower's view. The act was difficult to enforce, and Eisenhower was very disappointed in not being able to produce a better piece of legislation. Said Eisenhower, I wanted a much stronger civil rights bill in 57 than I could get. He later lamented, but the Democrats would not let me have it. Liberals would criticize Eisenhower for getting such a modest bill at the end of the day. But the leader of the Senate, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Democrat from Texas, argued that it was historically important because it was the first civil rights bill to pass Congress since 1875. According to presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, Senator Johnson also believed in so many words that the blacks were getting pretty aggravated and that they could become a problem for the Democrats since they got political pull now, and not to give them something to keep them quiet, but just enough not to make a difference. Democrats would possibly lose their support and blacks would cross back over to the Republican Party. Desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Within a year, more than 500 school districts desegregated. In 1948, Arkansas had become the first southern state to actually admit African Americans into state universities. But in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block 9 black students from entering Little Rock Central High School. When a confrontation turned violent, Ike sent in 1,000 soldiers from the famed 101st Airborne Division to protect the students. They would remain there all year. Here you see a picture of Elizabeth Eckford faced an angry mob while the Little Rock Nine, as they were called, would enter Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Foreign policy in the 1950s. When Ike entered the White House, the Korean War peace talks were at a stalemate. In order to bring the North Koreans to the table, he ordered an increase in aerial bombardments. Ike also threatened to use nuclear weapons if a truce were not forthcoming. Other factors were China's rising military losses and the death of Joseph Stalin. Negotiations soon commenced after the armistice was signed in 1953. Afterwards, the United States would establish military bases around the world. Eisenhower's Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. He believed that the containment theory of the Truman administration was needlessly defensive and desired the United States to shift toward removing the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe. Dulles promoted a policy known as brinkmanship, in which the United States would be willing to go to the brink of nuclear war in order to confront communism. The Eisenhower administration doctrine of massive retaliation controlled military spending, but stressed the use of nuclear weapons if the Soviets attacked on Western Europe, going to the brink, hence brinkmanship. School children in the 1950s regularly practiced these warnings. They were supposed to file into the interior hallways, crouch around the walls, and also cover their heads in their jackets as to protect them against flying glass under their desks. If they saw the blinding flash of an atomic explosion without warning, they were to duck and cover under their school desk. Foreign interventionists, the CIA's foreign interventions. The CIA was concerned over the regimes of some newly independent nations following World War II and caused Ike to involve the Central Intelligence Agency in toppling unfriendly governments. These actions would illustrate that the United States had finally cast off its isolationist stance and had become fully involved in the escalating Cold War. In May of 1951, the Iranian parliament seized control of Britain's run oil industry. Mohammad Mossadegh cut diplomatic ties with Great Britain and insisted that Iran should only sell and profit from their own oil. Dulles was afraid that Iran was falling under communist control, so the CIA and British intelligence MI6 launched Operation Ajax to remove Mohammad Mossadegh, which they were successful. The United States government provided massive support for the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. There would be a covert operations also in Guatemala, forcing Colonel Arbenz Guzman into exile into Mexico. Indochina. In the early 1950s, most of the British colonies in Asia were either independent or about to become independent. However, the French in Indochina and the Dutch in Indonesia also had colonies there and were not willing to grant the status and resisted all efforts. One such area was French Indochina, which was composed of modern-day Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam's Communist Forces leader was Ho Chi Minh. he and his forces worked to overthrow the French there, and at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they were able to trap the French forces. Much like Germany and Korea, the country of Vietnam was divided between a communist North and a free South. The free South would be supported by the United States. In the Geneva Accords, representatives from France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and the Viet Minh signed the accords, which also gave Laos and Cambodia their independence and divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh communists were given control of the north and the French remaining south of the line until nationwide elections were held in 1956. In South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic nationalist, became the new president and was very autocratic. And by 1957, communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong were launching attacks on Diem's government. The domino theory. Eisenhower outlined his administration's falling domino theory, which used the analogy of dominoes set up next to each other, to discuss the tendency of one nation after another to fall to communism once one in the region did. The fear of a number of Americans was that the USSR was directing the communist movements throughout the world and causing the worry that every pro-communist insurgency would lead to increased USSR and communist control of the world. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO, was delivered on 8 September 1954. It was very similar to NATO, but only weaker. There was no joint military command like NATO. Most important, members resided outside the region. Signatories in Manila of countries such as Australia, Britain, France, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, and the U.S. pledged joint action against aggression upon any member nation. On February 1, 1955, it was ratified by the U.S. Senate. In a separate action, the signatories of SEATO pledged to support and aid South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, who were excluded by the Geneva Agreements from entering into a separate military alliance. Re-election and foreign crisis. Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson again on the first ballot and Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee as vice president. Kefauver narrowly defeated JFK for vice president's nomination. Republicans renominated Eisenhower and Nixon. During the campaign, Democrats asserted the right of all citizens to equal educational opportunities, favored public over private development of water power, and supported 90 to 100% parity payments to farmers. Republicans approved the Supreme Court's order to progressively eliminate segregation and advocated partnership between federal and state agencies and private enterprise to develop water power and supported flexible parity payments. Stevens proposed an international ban on the hydrogen bomb testing. And although the later stages of the campaign were marred by the Suez Crisis and the beginning of trouble in Hungary, they made little difference at the polls. When Stevenson lost, they asked his reaction. He says, "Well, I'm too old to cry and it hurts too much to laugh." Repression in Hungary. When Stalin died in 1953, the new premier of the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. As premier, he planned to lessen Stalin's policy of control over the satellite nations and allow some independence. Hungarian leader Imre Nagy announced that he was taking Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact in 1956. The result was an invasion by Soviet forces and Nagy's overthrow. The Soviet Union used military force to suppress the uprising in Hungary in 1956, and it is estimated that 3,000 Hungarians were killed during the uprising. Another 12,000 were arrested and imprisoned. Of these, between 400 and 450 were executed. An estimated 200,000 people managed to escape to the West, to escape communism. The Suez War. The most fateful development in the Middle East involved the ownership of the Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. The canal was owned and operated by a private company, by which by 1950 Britain had become the company's largest shareholder. Gamal Nasser, in 1952, Egyptian king Farouk was overthrown by Nasser's army, with Nasser emerging as the ruler. After the establishment of Israel, however, The Arab states looked to Nasser to refuse canal usage to Israeli ships, and the United Nations Security Council ordered ending the illegal ban in 1950, but Egypt refused. On July 26, 1956, Nasser seized the physical plant of the Suez Canal Company, expelling company officials and nationalizing the canal. With a promise of support by Khrushchev, Nasser did not negotiate with the British and the French. And on October 29, 1956, Israel moved against Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula and defeated 45,000 Egyptian soldiers, reaching the canal in 4 days. On October 30th, Britain and France issued an ultimatum for both sides to move away from the canal, which of course Egypt did not, as expected, which gave the French and the British an excuse to invade under the guise of saving the canal. Nasser blocked the canal by sinking ships. Russia denounced the French and the British and threatened to drop bombs on both and called for an immediate ceasefire. The United States did not support its NATO allies, whom it felt had acted without good sense and had failed to get the advice of the United States, and backed an Asian-African UN resolution for an immediate ceasefire. Britain and France backed down in the face of a mounting world opinion. On October 4, 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit, although it was little more than a radio transmitter. Americans were shocked to see the advances of the Soviet space program and feared that soon space would become a war zone. The United States would respond by increasing and spending on new intercontinental ballistic missiles. NATO members would soon request missiles from the United States to defend themselves, and the National Aeronautic and Space Agency, NASA, would be established. American schools placed stronger emphasis on math and science courses, stimulating the passage of the National Defense Education Act to expand college and postgraduate education. It also meant that the new National Aeronautics and Space Administration took over the satellite program. The Eisenhower Doctrine. On January 5, 1957, before a joint session of Congress, Ike asked for the authority to extend economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern nation who requested it. Even armed forces it deemed necessary from the president's control by international communism. Ike promised an hourly communication with Congress when used. Its use would be in accordance to the U.S. treaty obligation and the UN Charter. In 1958, Congress approved of the Eisenhower Doctrine and the creation of the United Arab Republic, the overthrow of a pro-Western regime in Iraq, and an appeal to send forces to Lebanon to support tottering governments there, all marked this time period. To fill the leadership vacuum into the Middle East, Berlin was still divided, and it had been after World War II. Khrushchev was losing thousands of East Berliners to West Berlin and requested a summit in 1960 to discuss the Berlin issue. The planned summit took a turn for the worse when a United States spy plane, a U-2, was shot down over the Soviet Union, when the supposedly unmanned plane was revealed to have been piloted by Francis Gary Powers. Eisenhower took full responsibility but refused to repudiate the flight. Thus, the summit would end. Communist Cuba. Castro would become Cuba's communist premier in 1959 after overthrowing the Batista regime. Fidel Castro's communist forces defeated the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista after 2 years of fighting in 1959. Originally, Americans hoped that Castro would reform the government, but soon those hopes were dashed. He instead nationalized all foreign-owned property, of which the majority was American, and redistributed the land. In 1960, Castro signed a trade agreement with the USSR, and by October 1960, the United States reacted to those actions and stopped importing Cuban sugar and placed an embargo on the most exports to Cuba, and declared that it would defend its naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Evaluating the Eisenhower presidency. During Ike's second term, Alaska and Hawaii were added to the Union. The nation also entered a brief economic slump, but soon rebounded. Many historians at first viewed Ike's presidency as accomplishing very little, but recent scholarship has shed light on his policy's long-lasting effects. His desire to avoid divisive issues led him at times value harmony and popularity over justice, and one of his greatest decisions was to avoid war. After a truce in Korea, not a single American soldier died in combat during his 8 years as president, something no president has achieved since. Eisenhower would not address social racial problems, but he did balance the budget and kept inflation to the minimum. In his January 17, 1961 farewell address, he warned the nation of the dangers of the military industrial complex, asserting on its influence in the Congress and the White House. What is ironic about this statement, as the majority of historians do not address, is that the impact of his defense budget on the domestic economy was greatest during his administration than any administration that would follow him. And so concludes our study of the 1950s and the Eisenhower administration.